We've talked a lot about Breath of the Wild's world so far, and some of the stuff you get to do in it, but now let's talk about how you interact with that world as well as how it in turn affects you, starting with a pretty darn important element of a game this large, traversal. Now, the way I see it, apart from, running around, there are two primary methods of traversal that are unique to this game. The first and most impactful is climbing. When I first heard that you could climb stuff in Breath of the Wild, I made all the assumptions you would expect. It's going to require an item, you're only going to be able to climb on certain surfaces, that kind of thing. I was extremely surprised when I booted it up and found that nope, you can climb on basically everything. Every surface, as long as it's not raining, which we'll talk about later. I originally thought that such an ability would allow too much freedom, especially with a world this big. I mean, aren't there at least some areas the developers don't want us getting into? I mean, isn't that like how video games usually are? But no, they did it anyway. They gave us that freedom. And frankly, it's incredible. It really makes you feel like Hyrule is yours. It instills this incredible sense of possibility and gives you constant incentive to go off the beaten path and challenge yourself to reach new places. Traversal itself is now a bigger challenge than it's ever been, and of course that means it's also more fun and rewarding. Early in the game, you look up at a high place and you go, there's no way I can get up there. I'm sure I'll have to come back later. But then you try it, and maybe you have to go at it from a few different angles, or maybe you have to run off and brew up a stamina potion first, but then you just barely make it to the top with the very last sliver of your stamina and you're like, yes, I am the best Zelda man ever! And really, that reflects the very new and unique magic of Breath of the Wild and its world. It used to be all about solving puzzles or beating bad guys, but now even just the simple act of getting up onto one of the game's countless cliffs can be an immensely rewarding experience. That all kind of goes out the window once you get Rivali's Gale, but I already complained about that in the section on progression. The second major mode of travel is gliding with the paraglider. This little thing is absolutely genius. The world is so big, but the distance never feels like a barrier. It's never oppressive because you can always just climb up somewhere or warp to a tower and fly really fast in any direction, covering a great distance. It offers yet another huge sense of freedom because you never have to worry about getting down off a cliff or any high place. Once you put in the work to get somewhere high, your payoff is just gliding away, taking a smooth ride to wherever you like. It makes traversal infinitely more fun, and it complements the climbing incredibly well. These two modes combine to make verticality more important than it's ever been in any Zelda game, which makes Hyrule feel even bigger than it already is. If the map is a skillion square miles or whatever, it's that much more when you consider all the surfaces to climb. These abilities would be too useful early in the game if they had no limits, however, so here we have a very clever stamina system. Again, I talked about stamina in the section on progression, but I've got one more point to make about it here while we're talking about traversal specifically. One of the best things about Breath of the Wild is that it takes elements and concepts that were only touched on in other Zeldas and fleshes them out, builds each one into a big part of the whole experience rather than just a little something to make an entry stand out a bit more. We'll talk about the others in a while, but perhaps the most important one is stamina. Skyward Sword introduced the concept of stamina, and if you ask me, it didn't mean much in that game. It offered some more options in combat where you could perform extra big attacks, of course with the risk of running out of stamina and leaving yourself open for a moment. That was pretty cool. But beyond that, it was kinda worthless. If you were climbing up a wall or running up a steep slope or something, there were always stamina fruits along the way so that you didn't run out. If there weren't, then it would be impossible. You would simply not have enough stamina, but there were, so there was no real challenge. It was an interesting idea, and I certainly appreciated that they were trying new things with Skyward Sword, but it was an idea that fell a little flat. Like they thought it was a good idea and implemented it without making sure they could come up with clever ways to use it first. Breath of the Wild takes the concept of stamina and turns it into an integral part of the experience. It's not just a novelty, something new just for the sake of being new. It's a very natural and logical mechanic. Gliding is also a mechanic that we've seen in past Zeldas. In Wind Waker, you could glide with your Deku Leaf, but it took magic to do so. And it was like, why magic? How does that make sense? He's just holding onto a leaf. But here, oh, right, it takes stamina to hold onto your paraglider as long as you can. Makes perfect sense. Plus, stamina auto-regenerating makes things like gliding and climbing much less restrictive than if they still used magic, for instance. Instead of limiting you, it feels like it empowers you, even if it empowers you by making you feel limited at first. Since traversal has never been more important in a Zelda game, this system keeps you from dominating the terrain right from the get-go. Then thanks to Spirit Orbs, we have this very rewarding progression system where the more you explore, the more you can explore, yada yada yada. So there's technically one more significant way to get around in Breath of the Wild, but unfortunately I just don't feel like it makes much sense. I'm not really sure why they made horses so useless in this game. I mean, the first image we ever saw of it was of Link on a horse, riding a horse through this big open world with all its beautiful grasslands. It seemed so perfect. It seemed like horses were going to be more useful than they've ever been. But if you ask me, that just ain't the case here. They can get you somewhere in good time, sure, certainly faster than walking, but pretty much never in my journey did I want to just plow through uncharted territory super fast. Especially your first time through, it's impossible to take 3 steps in this game without getting distracted by something and wandering off the beaten path, usually somewhere your horse can't go. And that wouldn't be a problem if you could call your horse, like in, you know, every other Zelda with a horse ever, but you can't. You can whistle for them, which I think is pretty cool. I love how there's a button just for doing it. But this is one of those instances in a game when something is very realistic at the expense of being fun. Imagine how close you would actually have to be for a horse to hear you whistle in real life. That's pretty much how close you have to be for these horses to hear you. Therefore, if you want to use your horse, more than likely you've already wandered too far from it, and your best bet is going to be to skip the whistle and instead head to a stable and have them bring your horse to you. But of course, that wastes a lot of time, and you're just going to end up leaving it behind again anyway. Pretty much no matter where you're at, there's a faster way to get where you're going than to warp to a stable and talk to them and have them call your horse and then set off for your destination. Yes, you do have the ability to magically call your horse from anywhere if you have the magic armor found in the DLC, but 1, I'm trying not to talk about the DLC in this review, and 2, if you have the DLC, you also have a sick motorcycle, so that's something of a moot point. It's totally fine for other forms of travel to be better than riding horses, but this is frustrating for 2 reasons. 1, it would be very easy to make them less worthless. How about letting them hear your whistle as long as you're in the same section of the map, or within a certain radius at the very least? Or maybe they could follow you to a degree. Any of that would make a massive difference. 2, the fact that you can catch your own horses makes the idea of horses so much cooler. Some horses are rarer and better than others, so when you see one, you're like, oh my gosh, look at the solid color on that horse, I wonder what its stats are. Then there's the absolute thrill of trying to sneak up and catch one. And this is another thing that depends on your stamina, which is another stroke of genius. You want a really nice horse? You gotta be strong enough to tame one. Then you can name them and buy different getups for them and have them as your cool animal companions on your adventure. It has the potential to be a supremely awesome part of the game. But with all of these horsey limitations, the entire mechanic kind of goes out the window, for me at least. I mean, it's not like I never ever use horses. They're fine when it's early in the game and you've explored very little of the map and you want to get to a very specific place and focus super duper hard on not getting too sidetracked, but in my experience that has not been a very common occurrence. If I'm heading somewhere new, I'm taking my time to explore. And if I'm going somewhere far away that I've already been to, well, that leads us to warping. In a sense, warping to towers and shrines is an important mode of travel in Breath of the Wild, but it's not exactly a mode of traversal. You can only warp to places you've already been, so it's more about convenience than anything, beyond the fact that you can hit a tower from one side and use its height to glide into the other unexplored side, but you can say that about any high place. However, despite not technically feeling like a mode of traversal, it's still definitely worth mentioning. Just as it was with climbing, I was so happy to start the game and see that I immediately had access to this power. If you find a tower or a shrine, you can warp to it at any time, period. You don't have to wait until partway through the game to unlock the ability, and you're not limited to 5 or 6 warp points. In fact, it's almost too useful. If you're ever in a bind and about to be smushed by some big monster, you can always just bring up your menu and bye-bye. That sort of removes some of the sense of danger in taking risks and picking fights with higher level stuff. However, I really appreciate the convenience of it. Limitations in games are fine, but not being able to warp around easily would definitely hinder my enjoyment. Getting places would be too much of a chore. This way, it's never a problem to return to a place you've already been. Unless you're bothered by the loading screens, which, yeah, they can be a little long, I'll admit. Finally, it feels kinda funny to call shield surfing a mode of traversal because it's more for fun than anything, but we gotta talk about it somewhere, right? It's not as useful or intuitive as gliding, but shield surfing is similar to gliding in that it's very freeing. It's a way to get down from a high place in a very quick and very fun manner. Really, it's a testament to just how aware the designers were of the need for Breath of the Wild's traversal to be constantly enjoyable and offer a lot of variety. I don't think I would have even come up with the idea myself, but its inclusion is just delightful. The world already feels feels like a big toy sometimes, and shield surfing adds another layer to the fun, brings in another element to keep you playing and experimenting. And really, it does serve one practical purpose. You can't bring a horse into the desert, and there's a lot of sand to cross. Grabbing onto a sand seal and scooting along at high speed is really useful, and I would love to see this idea explored even more in future games. Maybe dragging behind roving enemies and horses? Shield surfing is also interesting because it's another example of something that's been done in a past Zelda game, namely surfing down the snowy mountain in Twilight Princess, that is fully realized and turned into something practical in Breath of the Wild. It's no longer just a mini-game to be played in one specific place. So that's how you interact with Breath of the Wild's terrain, but what about the stuff? Well, let me tell you, there's a whole lot of stuff interacting in this game. Also somewhat new to Breath of the Wild is physics. Now, I say somewhat because obviously previous games have indeed employed physics. It's kind of how games work, but never have they been such an integral part of the game. Nearly every single thing in the world is a free-moving object that can be affected by gravity and wind. Even ingredients and raw materials can be carried around and dumped wherever you please. Bombs can now roll down hills, yet another thing that Skyward Sword sort of touched on, but not to the same extent. Rupees, curiously enough, are really the only things that you don't purposefully pick up by hitting a button, and you come across freestanding ones lying on the ground very rarely, pretty much just when you're harassing Bloopies. Most objects are also destructible. Your weapons and materials and trees and boxes, etc. all can be burned and broken. But all this wasn't put in place just so they could be like, look at these fancy physics, look at all this destructible stuff, isn't this game cutting edge? Breath of the Wild's physics fit the theme that's strengthened by your new traversal abilities. The idea that the world is yours. You have limitless options, you can play however you want to play. That's why when coming up with the runes, they didn't just give us the usual Zelda stuff. No boomerang, no lens of truth, no spinner, no stuff that's mostly good in specific situations used as progression tools. The runes in this game, which act as your quote items, are all about using this physics system to interact with the world in much broader ways, and this is what truly turns Hyrule into your playground. I'll talk a little more about each specific rune in another section, but the possibilities the Zelda team gave us here are staggering. Stasis alone, which not only freezes objects but allows you to hit them to build up their momentum so you can watch them blast off, is a huge game changer. Unfortunately, I'm not nearly as clever as a lot of other people on YouTube, but the stuff you can do with stasis is absurd. Then magnesis is another big one. There are a lot of metal objects out there, and they pretty much just gave us magnesis and said, here, metal objects are now your plaything. Have fun, Magneto! You can use this ability for fun, or fighting, or, of course, for puzzling, which, again, is something we'll talk about later. Sorry, gotta stay on track. Bombs are certainly a Zelda staple, but an explosion is always going to be a very practical and desirable thing. Then there's Cryonis, which might be the least enormously useful out of all the runes if you have to rank them, but it's still a big deal. It's perfect for traversing water, and its applications in puzzle solving are limitless. Even beyond just physics and runes, you've got weather and elemental effects, and this adds another layer of complexity. There was a big whoa moment when I realized just how many different ways the pieces of this game could interact with each other. It was the first time I saw that burning grass created an updraft that could give me a boost with my paraglider. I was just like, what on earth? That's so awesome! The game is filled with random little interactions like that you've just gotta discover. Take out an arrow in a hot place? Look at that, you've got a flaming arrow. Just make sure to shoot it, or put it away before it burns up. Outside in a thunderstorm? Watch out for metal objects getting struck by lightning. Or hey, use magnesis to weaponize the lightning. Got some ice troubles? Any kind of fire will melt it. Campfire, flaming sword, fire arrow, whatever. No spring water or special blue flame needed here. It's raining or your enemy's standing in water? Then your shock arrows will do tons of damage and stun them. Nothing is arbitrary. Nothing works just because you've got an item that says it works and you use it on something that was made to be affected by that item. Everything follows logic. Wood burns, ice melts, water conducts electricity, heat rises. If you're still experimenting with how the game works and you think doing a certain thing will work a certain way, there's a pretty good chance that you're right. Speaking of weather and how it affects you though, real quick, that's stinking rain! Now, I'm very conflicted here. I like the idea of something limiting your ability to climb. In fact, the Zora Wing of the Divine Beast quest just might be the best because of that long and very challenging sequence where you've got to travel up a mountain without climbing at all because of the constant rain. Temporary limitations are good. They make you think differently. They prevent you from being too overpowered all the time. The problem with rain making it next to impossible to climb, though, is that it's one of those things that probably sounded great on paper, but is a whole different story when you actually apply apply it to the game as a whole. Fun versus realism is a constant issue in game design, and as we discovered with calling horses, just because something is realistic, that doesn't mean it's fun. And in this case, rain messing up your climbing means spending a lot of time just standing around, sometimes waiting minutes and minutes for the rain to stop. That is not fun. No one is gonna think that that is fun. If you can find some covering, you can build a campfire and wait it out, or you can go do something else, but come on, you're here, you wanna do the thing you wanna do, and wouldn't you know it, every single time you're about to climb this specific thing, that rain starts in again. It's not the sort of thing that ruins the game, and of course it's not always a problem, but when it is, it can be a humongous pain. It would be much better if there was some way to eventually thwart it. Maybe you get an item that prevents slipping partway through the game, maybe the suit bonus for the climbing outfit prevents slipping, maybe the more stamina you have, the less you slip. Just something. Some way to feel like you eventually overcame the rain. Rivali's Gale does help a lot, but man, it's still just annoying. To swing back around and conclude my point though, between all the elemental effects and runes and everything, you've got yourself a Zelda game that's big on destiny and Ganon thwarting and princess saving and all that like usual, but even removed from all that, also acts as a giant toy box. The physics system and the tools you're given to utilize it change everything, whether it's working through dungeons or damaging enemies or just goofing off and having a good time. It's another thing that keeps the huge world from being bland and boring like too many open worlds in games. It's what gives Hyrule life. No matter where you go or what you do, there's always a new way to go about solving a problem or some new interaction to see. Now let's dip back into what I was talking about earlier though. Stuff that other Zeldas toyed with, but Breath of the Wild fully realizes and fits into its cohesive world. One thing is temperature. Ocarina of Time introduced the idea of being damaged by high temperature areas with Death Mountain Crater and the Fire Temple. If you wanted to hang out in a volcano without your heart slowly draining, you had to go get yourself a red tunic. In Breath of the Wild though, the whole concept is implemented so naturally. You've got a temperature gauge right there on your screen that tells you how close you are to taking damage, and there's no single, the extreme temperature place that hurts you. Every area of Hyrule has a temperature which changes depending on different things, and as you move around, that temperature naturally goes up and down. Get higher in altitude, it tends to go down. Get closer to Death Mountain, it goes up. Gerudo Desert, and I feel this is a stroke of pretty genius design, becomes too hot in the day and too cold at night, like a real desert. Again, it all follows logic rather than being a simple barrier that's overcome by getting the right item. And how you go about protecting yourself against the elements is up to you. You can wear the proper attire, and even then you'll need multiple pieces of the right gear to protect yourself against the most extreme temperatures. Finally getting heat and cold resistant armor felt like a very big moment for me, very empowering. Then you can brew up some elixirs and meals to protect yourself as well, and another satisfying moment for me was learning the difference between very hot and actually on fire, and figuring out how to make the right elixir to get myself up Death Mountain. No, I didn't have to beat the right temple to get the right item to make the game let me up there. I just had to figure out how to do it. Then, hey, look at that. If it's cold, you can just hold a burning stick or sword, or huddle up next to a bonfire if you want. There's that logic again. Fire is warm. Put fire near body, body warm too. What do you know? Next up, we've got breakage. We already talked about this a lot in a previous section, so I won't get into it here, but suffice it to say, it is another thing that a previous Zelda only touched on. Skyward Sword gave you shields that wore down and broke over time, and you only got an unbreakable shield for beating a boss challenge that was totally dumb and stupid because that game had some dumb and stupid boss battles, but that's way beside the point. Breath of the Wild, your shields and weapons wear down and break after long enough. Now let's talk about stealth. Stealth is one of those things that you take part in very rarely in Zelda games, and only in the cases when those games give you no other choice. You're trying to get somewhere, and there are guys that, for whatever dumb reason, instantly make you lose if they see you. Wind Waker is a great example of this. You lose your sword, so you've got to avoid moblins or else they'll set you on fire and put you in a cell. After you get your sword back, however, stealth goes out the window. There's positively no reason to use it ever again, and in fact, you can't. After that specific sequence, you don't even have the option to hide in barrels anymore. Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks did use stealth to a greater degree. I'll certainly give them credit there, but these were still very specific enemies in very specific circumstances. In Breath of the Wild, however, any enemy is an enemy you can sneak up on. As we discussed before, this game can be challenging, and you can find yourself in the presence of an enemy you have little chance of beating. But you've always got the option to crouch down and hide in the grass and either slink away or close in for a stealth attack. It's extremely awesome that they incorporated stealth kills into a Zelda game. Later on, when you're super strong, it doesn't matter as much, but when you're still pretty weak, sneaking into an enemy camp and taking out each sleeping foe one by one? Well, that's something I'm used to doing in an Assassin's Creed game or something, certainly not a Zelda game. And of course, stealth is the perfect way to get a lay of the land and look for chances to take out your enemies without even getting close, usually thanks to exploding barrels that are very strangely yet very conveniently kept around everywhere. And just so there's no frustration in trying to figure out how quiet you're being or what you're accidentally doing that's waking up your enemies, right there on the screen, a little doodad that lets you know at all times. I'm sure I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but once more, stealth here makes sense. It follows logic. Like everything else, the idea is fully realized and it fits in perfectly with the rest of the world. Finally, we come to two older concepts, monster spoils and potions. Wind Waker introduced the idea of getting specific loot from specific monsters, though most of these spoils went towards specific side quests and meant little after those quests were completed. There were a few, however, that could be used to make certain potions if given to the right characters. I never really bothered, seeing as that game is super duper easy and eventually you get some awesome grandma soup that makes all that worthless, but it's good that they tried out the mechanic. Then Skyward Sword, as usual, was at the forefront of pre-Breath of the Wild innovations. You could buy potions, but you could also augment them with all sorts of bugs you found out in the world, making them way more potent. This was really awesome at the time, but surprise surprise, Breath of the Wild takes the idea and makes it really work. First off, now instead of taking your bugs and stuff to a guy and spending rupees to get them all blended together, you brew your own potions, which, funny enough, in this game are called elixirs. There are critters all over Hyrule, grasshoppers, butterflies, that kind of stuff, and to make elixirs, you mix those critters with monster parts. Then in addition to elixirs, you can cook meals with all sorts of edible stuff you find everywhere, whether it's mushrooms or meat or fruit or whatever. And I gotta say, this whole system is quite in-depth. There are so many ingredients to find in the world, and there's no inventory limit, so you can hoard everything you come across. Each ingredient does something, and mixing them all together can create meals and potions that heal you or make you stronger or make you faster or protect you from the elements like we talked about earlier. Elixirs in particular use a fairly complicated system of buffs where each individual element either adds or strengthens an effect. It took me a while to pick up on the fact that food cannot be mixed with monster parts or critters, and also to learn which animals are critters and which are food, so I do wish they were all better separated or classified or something. But after I learned how it worked, it was fun to experiment. Fun to just start throwing stuff into a cook pot and see what comes out. There's always a chance for your recipe or elixir to gain a random additional effect, so there's that little thrill when the music rises up and you know you got something extra good. In addition to elixirs, monster parts and critters can be used to upgrade your armor. Skyward Sword sort of almost used this idea. You collected materials and used them to upgrade your items and shields, sure, but that was pretty different, and honestly, in this case, I can't even necessarily say that that was an inferior version of what we've got in Breath of the Wild. It was pretty different, and actually kind of great. Upgrading your major progression items was quite novel. This time around, it's all about armor, or gear. You can find this gear out in the world, or buy it from shops, and the whole system adds a lot to Zelda. We've just seen Link in his green tunic so many times that it's refreshing to have all these other options. Style is a big element here, for sure, but much more important are the effects that gear can bestow upon you. Naturally, different pieces raise your defense stat different amounts, and can I say real quick, I love how we've got clear attack and defense stats for the first time in this game. Also, just about anything that a meal or an elixir can do for you, gear can do for you. Wait a minute though, wait. Did you just say you can use the stuff you collect to upgrade your gear? Well, howdy doody hot dog! Gathering stuff to upgrade stuff is one of Arlo's favorite things. You take your gear to a great fairy to get it buffed, and I love how they did this. It's a big open world, so naturally people are going to find these great fairies in different orders, so whichever fairy you find first lets you upgrade your gear once. After that, each fairy lets you upgrade once more, and they all get the same ability, so you don't have to go track down specific ones to hit certain levels. It's a great example of how to achieve linear progression in a game with a non-linear structure. And oh man, my first time through, stumbling upon a new fairy felt like I'd struck gold. I was just so ecstatic that I could make my gear even stronger. I love the upgrading process too. I mean, these cutscenes are amazing. With each new fairy, you're like, oh geez, what's she gonna do to him this time? Do I need to look away? Most importantly though, I love using up my stuff. It's nice to feel like I earned my upgrades by killing lots of bad guys, and it can be fun to go off and try to track down that one frog I need to make my pants stronger or whatever. Then there's the added satisfaction of getting a bonus when you nab a full set and upgrade it high enough. It's fun to hold your breath waiting to see if you get something good. Sometimes you'll probably be disappointed, but other times you'll be jumping for joy. Climbing gear stamina discount, anyone? All these mechanics, meals, elixirs, armor upgrading, comprise what Nintendo collectively refers to as the crafting aspect of the game. And while it is enjoyable and certainly a great new direction for Zelda to take, get ready for some griping, because I feel that this is easily the single weakest aspect of the game, the area with the most flaws and the most room for improvement. These mechanics are definitely examples of older concepts being fully realized, kind of in a sense, but also kind of not fully realized. First problem. See, elixirs are the most complex to create. Like I said, the whole ingredient system is really interesting and fun to experiment with, but meals are so much easier to make, and they're still really good at buffing you, so I just go with them most of the time. Very rarely do I see a point in brewing up an elixir versus cooking a meal. And it's not just that meals are easier to make than elixirs, they're also just too easy to make in general. Don't get me wrong, I like that each ingredient gives a specific effect, and thus there's a logic to making meals. It wouldn't be as fun if every recipe was always a really specific list of ingredients that you had to learn somewhere or stumble upon by sheer luck. It would be kinda aggravating. But the ease of creation and mostly the abundance of ingredients in the world make buffs and heart recovery things you can absolutely take for granted. Why try using all the right critters and monster parts to make yourself an exactly perfect strength buff when you can just throw a bunch of mighty bananas into a pot and get a meal that recovers a ton of hearts and maxes out your strength? Even if you're not interested in buffs, meat is everywhere, and after a while you'll basically never run out of the stuff you need to make meals that heal all your hearts, which removes way too much of the challenge. Another annoyance, earlier in the game you can make meals that not only heal all your hearts, but also give you some extra temporary ones. Thing is, the temporary ones can never exceed the maximum number of hearts you can potentially earn on your own. So later in the game, when you have very few extra heart spaces, if any, depending on how you spend your spirit orbs, everything you make just maxes out. And it's like, great, it doesn't even matter what I throw in the pot. It won't make a difference anyway. It'll just heal me with no real added heart bonus. What you throw in means very little at that point. Like, if you're already gonna kinda break the system by making meals that easy to create, at least let me go all the way with it. Now, I am a bit torn here. It probably only feels like ingredients are too abundant because I spend so much time just messing around, and during my long travels, I naturally gather many ingredients. One could argue that this is why I've got meat skewers coming out the ears with no chance of ever being in a situation where I need hearts and can't get them. This could be my reward for being thorough. Easier play. And that's probably true. If I rushed through the game and didn't spend a lot of time exploring, things would be more difficult. I just think they could have hit a happy medium here. They could have made the cooking system intuitive without making it quite so easy to just lump everything together and get the best meal ever. Or, like with any of the elements in this game that I feel remove too much challenge, they could have placed more limitations on the system. I do like that bottles are an element of past Zeldas that the developers decided to overhaul in Breath of the Wild. Having a huge inventory for meals and elixirs without having to collect or manage bottles is very freeing and opens up the system a lot wider. But having fewer inventory slots earlier in the game or something would have made a huge difference here. Maybe you could upgrade your meal and elixir slots in the same way you upgrade your sword, shield, and bow slots. Just one example. In addition to meals being way too easy to throw together en masse, another problem is that effects granted from gear and effects granted from meals and elixirs don't stack. You can boost a stat 3 times and that's it. This means that once you get some good armor sets, there's little point in eating stuff to buff yourself. I like to go for attack more than anything. In any game, really. And once I got my full barbarian set, I had no more use for attack boosting meals. I could still go for meals that grant defense, but why do that? I've got 1,000 meat skewers to heal with and my barbarian armor protects me just fine. What's the point in worrying about defense? This isn't to say that the lack of stacking renders buffs completely useless. It's a little nice to be able to buff different stats without changing your gear again and again, so mixing buffs together is certainly a benefit, but it just feels like it limits you for no good reason. Breath of the Wild is all about doing it your own way and figuring out how to make the game work for you. So finding out that 3 boosts to a stat is all you get is really disappointing. Just like with the temporary hearts thing, it's like if the system is already kind of broken, you might as well let us go all the way. If I want to wear my fully loaded barbarian armor and swig some sword juice and get crazy powerful, why can't I? Also, real quick, while we're on the subject of buffs, it's super annoying that the game doesn't tell you how much a stat boost is actually boosting you. I hate this in any game. Defense up. Okay, up like 5%? 20? 50? 100? I have no idea here. Can I get an actual number? When it comes to its crafting elements, though, Breath of the Wild's greatest sin is that this isn't really crafting at all. It wants you to think it is. They even put craft your own adventure right on the back of the box. But it's seriously not. Crafting is taking materials that you've gathered and making stuff out of them. You might be able to take all this to a non-gamer and convince them that cooking counts as crafting. It does sort of fit the definition, but look at other games. Cooking is not crafting in other games. Cooking is cooking, or alchemy, or something like that, and most games with cooking also have actual crafting. And upgrading your armor? That's not crafting by any definition. At least not the way I see it. Going into Breath of the Wild, as you know, I didn't know much about it. I read that box and I was intrigued by the idea of a crafting system in a Zelda game. So I played it, and I played it, and I played it, and I wondered when I would finally find the person, or the forge, or the workbench, or whatever, that would let me craft stuff. I talked to every Goron on Death Mountain 5 times just to make sure I didn't miss anyone, and I kept getting these precious gems. Oh man, I've got tons of rubies, and look at that! Right in the description, they contain the power of fire. I can't wait to forge my own fire sword. Finally, I looked it up. Nope. No actual crafting in this game. And it's a shame, because monster parts and materials are so much fun to collect. I'll admit, there's a part of me that likes to collect them even after they become useless. Or I like to find really valuable ones, just because I could sell them for a lot of rupees if I wanted to, even though I don't really have much of a use for rupees, which we'll talk about in a bit. It doesn't make any sense, but in a very shallow, dumb sort of way, I like hoarding all of it. I do like that aspect of this game. But I'm also constantly disappointed that there isn't more to do with my materials. Upgrading armor? Awesome, like I said. But that eventually ends, and beyond that, the stuff mostly just sits there in your inventory. I mean, you've got quests and whatnot that use them. There are some little uses here and there, but nothing substantial, nothing constant and really useful. The closest thing to crafting in this game is having specific people in the world make a handful of specific things for you. Each race has a legendary weapon that can be remade whenever it breaks, but these weapons are generally pretty useless, as we've talked about before, and it's not even almost worth the trouble to get them remade. You can use your gems to create jewelry in a shop in Gerudo Town. You know, if you want to wear a headpiece and mess up your armor bonus. Or actually, you can use ancient parts to make guardian armor and ancient arrows at the Akala Ancient Tech Lab. This is actually pretty good. Armor only needs to be made once, but the option to make ancient arrows is decently useful. Even so, this system leaves a heck of a lot to be desired. The weirdest thing about all this is that the game feels like it was built with an actual crafting system in mind, but that they just didn't include it. I honestly think it might have been a crunch thing, like they decided at the last minute they didn't have time or something. I mean, think about it. In order for crafting to be a consistent part of the gameplay, you have to be able to craft something expendable, something that gets used up. So what kind of item does Breath of the Wild have that used to be permanent in your inventory but has now been turned into a consumable resource? That's right! Weapons! And also shields! Even arrows! They were definitely a consumable in the past, but they were so easily refilled. They were more like a meter than anything. Now they're a real item that you have to find or buy all on your own, and special arrows are more powerful and useful than ever. How on earth could they create a game where weapons and shields and bows work this way, and where you collect tons and tons of materials, and not give you the ability to craft stuff of your own? It's baffling. Never has there been a bigger missed opportunity in any Zelda game, or possibly any Nintendo game, period. Breath of the Wild is like some sort of beautiful animal that's inexplicably missing one of its legs. Like it was built to be a certain way, but one of its key elements is just kinda not there for some reason. But instead of just complaining about it, let's talk about exactly what they could have done to fix this and give Breath of the Wild a true crafting system. First off, imagine there are forges or workbenches or something where you work. The fun of cooking in this game is walking up to a cook fire and manually dumping in a bunch of ingredients instead of taking them to some guy who works in a shop. So when you craft items, it's all in your hands. You don't have to physically hold the items like you do when you're cooking, that would be too cumbersome, but you do go to the forge and do the crafting yourself. A fairly small detail, but a piece of flavor that I feel is very important. These whatevers are located all over Hyrule, in every town and stable. Enough of them that you never have to spend too much time hunting one down, but not so many that you can just craft your way out of any dangerous situation. At these things, you can craft melee weapons, shields, bows, and arrows of all kinds. Naturally, early on, your options are limited and your created weapons and shields are weaker. Special arrows are very costly. However, all over the world you find blacksmiths, and much like great fairies, each one passes on their knowledge and allows you to make stronger stuff that uses more materials. I could picture this so easily too, it's such a Nintendo gag. Hiya, I'm Jimothy from the Ancient Order of Blacksmiths. We're all over the place. Want me to pass on some knowledge? Ba-da-da-ba-da-da. Maybe some of them even require that you complete quests before they give you their knowledge so that you can't just run to each one at the start of the game. What you're left with here is a way to constantly use your materials if you so desire, and constant incentive to gather those materials in the first place. It's yet another feedback loop to make the game all the more addictive and empowering. Imagine yourself at the start of the game, using wood from a tree that you chopped down and some stone that you pulled from an ore deposit to craft the very arrows that you use to raid an enemy camp. Or imagine stumbling upon the last bit of flint that you need to craft a bundle of bomb arrows so you can use them to take down the stone talus. That would be so much fun! Plus, your growing weapon options would help bring logic and meaning to the game's progression system, which, as I said in an earlier section, is a little lame when it comes to weapons. Better and better items spawning just because you're completing shrines doesn't make a lot of sense. This, though, it's perfect. It's driven by you. It's your reward for being meticulous and slaying lots of monsters and exploring everywhere. It's worth noting, someone could argue that the ability to create weapons might unbalance the game, much like I've claimed having an unbreakable weapon would, but I don't think this is true. Weapons are already free. They're lying around everywhere. They just take a little work to get most of the time. This hypothetical system doesn't mean unlimited free weapons. You're limited by the amount of materials you've got and, of course, as always, the number of inventory slots in your bag. It would just be another option, and if you didn't feel like getting into any of this stuff, you could just ignore it and take all the weapons and arrows the game already throws at you. Though I will say, if you had the ability to craft special arrows, I would hope that the game gave you fewer for free. As it is, they're way too easy to come by after you've been playing a while. By the end of the game, even if I was still drowning in special arrows, it would be nice if it was because I made them with my own two hands, not because Lionel's dropped like 30 shock arrows at a time. And another note about spending resources on weapons. A lot of people have suggested that even if you can't craft weapons, you should at least be able to repair them. For a time, I felt that this made sense. It would be something to spend materials and/or rupees on, after all, and come on, in the real world, what do you do with a weapon that's breaking? You don't hit stuff with it until it breaks, you take it to a blacksmith so they can repair it. But the more I think about it, the more I think this is a bad idea. As I've said, hoarding weapons and worrying about losing each one is the best way to not enjoy this game. Things work out best when you just go for it. Use everything up without reservations, knowing that you'll always find more. Being able to repair a damaged weapon sounds good on paper, but in reality, it would mean having a full inventory and leaving behind great stuff all the time. It would mean lugging around low health weapons instead of just chucking them at guys' heads for extra damage, and on that note, who would ever throw their weapons if they knew they could potentially be saved? With the game the way it is now, I say a repair option wouldn't be terrible, but it's not the best idea. If the game used the crafting system that I've proposed, then I would say yes, it would be terrible. The idea of holding onto your weapons so you can fix them later would undermine the system of just making new ones constantly. Either way though, the game was built around weapons that are expendable, so making them expendable but also not expendable would kind of throw things off. Back to it, another thing that would be great to do with materials. How about different upgrade paths for armor? Like you could choose what kind of buffs to give it. As it is right now, you can sell armor and buy multiples of a single set, but it's like, what's the point? If you have the armor, why would you need more than just one version? Well, there's your answer. You could have one barbarian set that reduces stamina drain from power attacks, one that makes your sword swing faster, and one that only boosts your attack power twice but comes with a higher armor rating. There are so many options. The potential for mixing and matching is huge. Lastly, how about making offensive elixirs, like ones that you can chuck at your enemies? One kind could explode, one kind could put enemies to sleep or make them go berserk and attack each other, and one could attract bees and other aggressive animals. This would give us even more incentive to go out picking mushrooms, and just like with weapon crafting, it wouldn't be hard to implement. It would use mechanics that are already programmed into the game. Baddies can already sleep and attack and get chased by bees. It would be a really simple matter of giving us bottles to throw. And look at that, you've already got a dedicated throw button. What do you know? One final thing to say while we're talking about the game's resource economy. Rupees are probably more useful in Breath of the Wild than they've ever been, especially earlier in the game. They can be used used to buy fancy armor sets and powerful special arrows and lots of stuff. Yet, I still wish there was more to do with them. If we had more uses for our materials, this wouldn't be as much of a problem because we would have less to sell and money would be more scarce. But as it is, selling unneeded materials nets you absurd amounts of rupees. Even if they really wanted to leave out a more advanced crafting element, it would have been nice to have something else to dump money into beyond special arrows because, like I said, eventually you just get tons of those. Buying a house is about the best money sink you get, and sometimes I get the feeling that it's satisfying not because it gets you a house, but because it gives you a place to dump your rupees and feel like you did something with them. Now, paying to help rebuild other parts of Hyrule would be awesome, though that whole idea is something I could talk about for way too long if I let myself, so I'll do you a favor and just not. So those, my friends, are the ways in which you interact with the world of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild. The fact that there was so much to cover on this subject says a lot. It speaks to the immense depth of mechanics on display, though unfortunately it also speaks to just how immensely some of them could be improved. Say what you will about the game, even if you weren't really impressed by it, though if that's you, I find it unlikely that you've stuck around long enough to hear this, you can't deny that the scope and complexity exceed any previous Zelda by a country mile and a half. Even if there is room to grow in some departments, a lot of room to grow, what we've got here is one heck of a starting point. If the Zelda team builds and improves upon it all in a sequel, then we're in for quite the experience when that day finally comes.